Hey guys, how you doing? Is anybody else as nervous as I am today? Make sure that you come on in here and let me know that you're here. Okay, this is making me nervous. Why am I the only one here? And yet I know I'm not the only one here because I can see there are 5 of us here. Okay, there we go. All right. I know exactly how you feel. So if you are here, make sure that you sign in. Hi, Casey. Morning, Noah, Sarah. Good to see you guys. Thank you for keeping me company and grounded today. Because definitely I feel I need it. I wanted to tell you, I think I already sent out an announcement about this, but Carolyn Forche, who was one of our great spokes people for Poetry of Witness, and just a wonderful poet and sweet, smart person, is going to actually be doing a live Zoom with us on the evening of November 12th at 7 o'clock. I'm going to post a link for you guys, and if you go, you can either get extra credit for that, or you can use that as your arts event if you like. You can ask her questions because she'll be doing live chat, and so we'll be choosing questions that you guys pose, and so that's a pretty wonderful opportunity to talk to an amazing poet and, as I said, sort of spokesperson. She started out her poetic career winning the Yale Younger Series, which is a big honor in itself, but then she was sent as a kind of very minor aide-de-camp to El Salvador back in the 70s, and that's when she began to encounter what was really happening with the disappeared and the suppression and oppression and murders that were going on in El Salvador, and she was brave enough to step up and speak about it, and it was a game changer, certainly for El Salvador, and also in its own way for poetry. She was widely attacked for doing this and accused of all kinds of things, but she literally risked her life to speak out, and so I think she sort of joins the ranks of Tina Han and others who have tried to, provide rescue and be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves because they're being silenced in one way or another. Hello, Allison, and Nina, and Lauren, and Maria, and everybody. By the way, I think it's Becca who is not here this morning because she got up at 5:30 this morning to be one of the poll watchers, and she's going to be doing that until, I don't know, 9 or 10 o'clock tonight. So God bless Becca for doing what she does as well. But we are going to start talking about Annie Dillard. And she's really kind of an interesting character, as I hope you got for yourself. And I guess the first thing I would say is, as you're reading the chapters in her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, do you have a sense of where she is and who she is and what she's doing? Because I always felt like she was living somewhere, let's say in Appalachia, and kind of in the middle of this very poor, maybe rural scene, and somebody who was completely surrounded by nature and went out into nature. Um, and so I was a bit surprised to find out after having read the book, oh, Becca, you're here. You know, I meant to tell you, and I meant to tell all of you, oh God, and I meant to tell my last class too, that if you ever miss one of these lectures, I keep them posted for at least a couple of weeks afterward. You can always go back, and if in your future lives you ever want to come back, I don't know that you would, they'll be available to you because you'll have the link to get to them. So I never take them entirely down, but I do I forget what it's called, but you sort of like make them so they're not publicly available anymore. You'd have to be looking for me to find it. I guess that's what it comes to. But it's YouTube, right? So I'm not going to actually delete them. I'm just pulling them from their public listing. So that way you sort of know if that happens. I had a student who like slept late one day, and I meant to tell him, well, you know, you always go back and look at those lectures later, or if you're feeling confused, you can replay parts of it, whatever. Annie Dillard and her husband, Richard, lived near Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia, in an ordinary suburban house, and their backyard sloped down to a sort of not terribly well-known or impressive stream called Tinker's Creek, which was 17 feet wide at its widest. She thought of herself as a, quote, ordinary housewife, and she believed that nobody would ever be interested in reading what she wrote because she felt like she was, you know, she had no voice. Speaking of the voiceless, right? Who would be interested in? And she was 20 years old because she had met Richard Dillard when he was her teacher at Hollins College. It was an all-women's college at that point. And so she's 20 years old. She thinks of herself as a suburban housewife. And that creek that she keeps escaping to is literally in her own backyard. I found that kind of stunning. But I also find it incredibly hopeful, because when you think about Thoreau living at Walden Pond, and now I keep thinking of it as being sort of like, I don't know, one of those ponds at Chenango State Park. Do you know what I mean? Some place that's very funny, Nicholas. I love that. She thought she was writing to some monks. Well, I'm sure that monks really do appreciate her, because to me, she sounds a lot like a nun, like some sort of wild and precious life nun or something. I also found it really interesting that it never sounded to me like she was married or partnered in any way. And in fact, she would write about how she had to come in because it got dark, so she had to come back inside, but she really didn't want to. And those descriptions of her kind of lying on her back in bed with the world spinning around her, you know, well, it's not surprising to me that she and Richard got divorced, in fact. She was born Meta Ann in Pittsburgh in 1945. She's still alive, I'm happy to say. And she and her three sisters would visit their grandparents every summer on the south shore of Lake Erie. She was always interested in science. She collected rocks and things like that. And one of her favorite toys as a child was a microscope, and she would really get slides and pond water and things and look at the slides under the microscope. She was also an athlete, and that made me think about you, Daisy. She biked, she sledded, breaking her nose 2 days in a row. And she also fairly seriously played baseball, especially. She's a baseball fan and fanatic. She played baseball, basketball, and field hockey. Um, so, as a writer, she has published just about every kind of writing you could imagine, nonfiction, obviously. That's what we're reading in Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, but she's also written novels, poetry, um, a memoir. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which was her very first book, published in 1974. She is one of Obama's favorite writers. They have conversations from time to time, and he awarded her the National Humanities Medal while he was still president. She lives part of the time in Key West, Florida, and part of the time in the state of Washington. So that's about as much biography as I know, although, as Nicholas points out, there are podcasts of her, there are interviews with her. I know I posted at least one of them. I also recently posted an article she wrote about being in total eclipse and what that felt like. And Kayla, I'm so happy that you loved this reading. And so let's talk about it. She starts the seeing chapter of Tinker Creek. And I'm going to admit right out there that this is by far my favorite part of the book. If you thought that The Fixed was hard to take, you should just be grateful that I didn't ask you guys to read On the Horns of the Altar, because it gets so much worse in terms of just the gruesome side of nature. So let's admit right at the start that this might be the first nature writer that we're reading who really goes into some depth about that sort of nature read in tooth and claw, is the famous line from the poet Tennyson. And I know that Rachel Carson kind of hints at that a little bit during her description of Underseas, but it's nothing like what Annie Dillard gives you, which is really, I know, a world of, sort of one being tearing another apart. And we'll get to that. But because I am who I am, I love the sort of poetic and lyrical side of her and the more hopeful side of her, which reveals itself, I think, so beautifully in the chapter called Seeing. So, she starts with this memory of her childhood and how she would hide these treasures for other people in her neighborhood to find. And of course, it was the lowliest of treasures. She was hiding pennies. She would hide a penny or so, which she calls a free gift from the universe, right? She talks a lot about days in nature being a free gift from the universe. So, she would even draw arrows to the hidden penny. Do you remember that? With chalk scrawls that would say surprise ahead. And I think she's been doing the same thing ever since. I think that's a perfect story because of who she is. And I think she's been sort of pointing out the pennies that we have around us and sort of letting us know there's a surprise ahead her whole life as a writer. And her project is very similar, I'm sure you noticed this, to Mary Oliver, right? What Mary Oliver is doing. It's a celebration of the humble creatures, right? The 1-cent treasures of the earth, whether that's a grasshopper or a little copper penny that is hidden in a corner of the sidewalk. She writes, the world is in fact planted with pennies. And there she's talking about ripples of water in the stream, muskrats, insects, frogs, things that the rest of us might overlook. Again, to me, the idea that really where she's finding all this is in this little stream that runs along the back of the property is just dazzling. It's really kind of amazing. But yet it shouldn't be surprising because, you know, there's Thoreau really in a kind of public space living on this pond that's well known. Or, um, oh, I was just thinking of one other writer who I realized later is writing about something that is very close to home, right? You don't have to go all that far to find the treasures that you might be looking for. Um, she also has that very keen sense of the evanescence of nature that you see in Issa, right? The World of Dew. Well, you haven't read Issa yet. That's ahead of you still. Um, but the sort of now you see it, now you don't is how she describes it. So you better look quickly and look with your eyes open, because she's all about transformations. She's all about quick changes, sort of change your presto. There's a sense of magic and wonder to what she sees. You know, leaves turning into birds and turning back into leaves again, and then turning into birds again, and then turning back into leaves again. Do you remember that moment of her standing in front of the orange tree? Um, we'll be we'll be talking about that. So the chapter called Vision is in fact about just about every kind of vision you can think of, isn't it? Um, I mean, you guys could probably come up with a few of the different ways in which he uses the idea of sight and seeing, vision and visions in that one chapter. She talks about, you know, the blind who have had their vision restored to them, not always to happy effect, but what that is like, the vision of looking closely. She talks about how only the lover and the knowledgeable really see what's out there, like the expert on field mice who has noticed, I guess, these little tiny blades of grass in fields, and sees the cut stems in a gigantic field. And she says apparently he's constantly running into these things, whereas the rest of us, of course, would, you know, we would never see them at all. Or Gilbert Stuart, she quotes him. He's a famous British gardening writer who claimed that he could see the wind. Or Dillard herself. Do you remember she says that she used to be able to see flying insects in the air? You know, she would look and she would sort of see that curtain of flying insects in the air. If no one has ever told you this before, when it gets to be early spring again, and I know when it's November, I need to start thinking about spring already, there's a kind of reddish haze around the trees before there are any leaves. And so if you find yourself looking for it in, you know, let's say March or April, you'll actually see it. You'll see this kind of reddish haze, which are, you know, the buds that are just starting to break through, and will eventually turn into leaves, and in some cases will turn into flowers. It's really beautiful to be able to walk down the street and then sort of from a distance you suddenly do see this red haze, and you realize what you're looking at is kind of the glow of spring coming in. I'm glad, Annie, that you were able to see something like what she saw, that tree full of birds. And so she remarks a little bit sadly about how she doesn't see the flying insects the way she did. But she says, if I can't see these minutiae, I still try to keep my eyes open. Of course, she means that also in the slangy sense in which we'll say keep your eyes open. It means keep your awareness around you. And it's got to be reminding you of Mary Oliver, right? And her encounter with the grasshopper, and her way of saying, I don't know what a prayer is, but she says, I do know how to pay attention. And I think both of those writers are writers who are saying to us, you need to pay attention, you know, pay attention to the world. Pay attention to the small things, the overlooked things, the hidden treasures, right? The world full of hidden pennies that Annie Dillard uh, talks to us about. Um, and she also talks about the ways in which our vision can impede us from, I think, what she might call like an inner vision or a more a truer way of seeing things as they really are. That I think is one of the things that's so moving about when she writes about the newly sighted, right? The blind people who gain sight and they see things so differently than the way we do because they haven't been trained to take it for granted or trained to see it in one particular way. So she talks about the single-celled organism. Do you remember the famous scientist who says that the sense impressions of one-celled animals are not edited for the brain? You know, we see the world upside down, and then there's that part of the brain that has to work with the retina to turn it right back, you know, right side up again, which I have to tell you, when I think about that, it freaks me out. It's a little like looking at a TV screen or a computer screen and having to remind myself that I'm actually looking at a collection of dots. Um, I think when you think about the kinds of things that your brain automatically translates for you, if you think about what's really there too much, you almost lose touch with reality for a second. One night I'd been looking at a lot of different images on the computer for one reason or another, and I don't know if it was because I was preparing for a class or if I was like shopping online or something. But when I lay down, for some reason, when I lay down that night, it felt like hundreds of images went flashing across my brain. And they were, in fact, the images that I had just been looking at for the last, let's say, hour and a half. It was terrifying to me to realize that the back of my brain had actually stored up all those images, because normally our brain is kind enough to sort of file them away, put them in the filing cabinet. Well, this particular night, I guess my brain forgot to do the filing on time, and so the images were just still flying around, and they were there in sight. And I found that really disturbing. And so I've always been aware when I am on computer that, in fact, though I think that I'm moving from one thing to the next and therefore kind of like erasing as I go, the back of my brain does not know that and is carrying a lot of that information. So in terms of this filtering that we're constantly doing, right? The one-celled organism doesn't have that filter, it just has its one cell, at least as far as we know. And so the scientist said it means that only the simplest animals perceive the universe as it is. And I think that's another one of her big questions is, how is the universe really? What is the universe up to, really? And so she keeps asking that question as if she's holding the world up to a prism. You know, there's that sense of turning it, and every time you turn a prism, right, you'll see a different light, you'll see a different angle, it'll cast a different kind of rainbow onto the wall if you're lucky and it's a sunny day. So I think her writing is kind of prismatic that way. To me, most of all, she is a visionary. And I think she writes in the tradition of religious ecstatics, like Saint Teresa of Avila, I think it's called Avila, it might be Avila, who saw angels on a regular basis, apparently, and wrote, "When I fear I have done wrong, when I look to those who are less wise, when I forget transcendence and kneel in the meanings of color and shadow, when I tell lies to my soul, I seek out water, I follow its charm, a river, a stream, a lake, with its springs and currents. See how it offers life as it flawlessly flows and forms to the shape of this world, the contours of the land, the urge of earth. Hear how it sings under the sun of endless evaporation. That's St. Teresa. But it could really as easily be um, St. Annie Dillard, I think. I think they're sort of after that same idea of seeing the God in the world. And I do not think actually that Annie Dillard is conventionally religious. I wondered about that myself, and then I stumbled across a quote recently which made me feel she was kind of rejecting her own upbringing in traditional Christianity. But there's no question in my mind that she is constantly grappling with sort of the creator of this universe. And I think that is also part of why she writes about the dark side as well as the light side. Um, Mary Oliver tends to stay on the light side, or at least the dark side is more emotional than sort of actual and physical. So I would say that there are at least two dramatic climaxes in the chapter called Seeing, and perhaps you guys have found many more. Um, to me, the first, the setup in a way, is her experience with the orange tree, where I would say she realizes yet again that the world is magical and that we often fail to see what is right in front of us. So I'm going to read you a passage that I'm talking about from Pilgrim at Timber Creek, and hopefully you'll be glad to hear it for a second time. For a week last September, migrating red-winged blackbirds were feeding heavily down by the creek at the back of the house. One day I went out to investigate the racket. I walked up to a tree, and osage, I don't know if it's osage or osage, orange, and 100 birds flew away. They simply materialized out of the tree. We can see this. I saw a tree, then a whisk of color, then a tree again. I walked closer, and another 100 blackbirds took flight. Not a branch, not a twig budged. The birds were apparently weightless as well as invisible. Or it was as if the leaves of the Osage orange had been freed from a spell in the form of red-winged blackbirds. They flew from the tree, caught my eye in the sky, and vanished. When I looked again at the tree, the leaves had reassembled as if nothing had happened. Finally, I walked directly to the trunk of the tree, and a final 100, the real diehards, appeared, spread, and vanished. How could so many hide in the tree without my seeing them? The Osage orange, unruffled, looked just as it had looked from the house when 300 red-winged blackbirds cried from its crown. Cried from its crown. It's just, I think it just feels like a magic trick, like a magician. When they pull the endless scarves out of their sleeve, or pull things out of the hat, and you're thinking, how did they get there? How did they get there? That you're able to pull them out so endlessly. There's that legerdemain, right? The trick of the hand and the eye, that lightness that she captures so beautifully. And it's both funny, and it's a reminder that we're not always seeing what's there right in front of our eyes. But at least she goes out to the backyard to investigate, which is probably more than most of us do, right? So it's again a sort of a reminder to us to do that. And if you doubt that this is sort of in a visionary tradition, then I want you to consider the night she stayed too late at the creek. Do you remember that? She kind of spooked herself in a way. It felt to her like there were creatures in the dark, under the water. She didn't know what they were. She came home, and the quote is, "Later I lay open-mouthed in my bed, my arms flung wide at my sides to steady the whirling darkness." And when she opens her eyes, with her eyes open, she sees the mysterious figures she could not quite make out in the water. This is a quote again. "Dark, muscled forms curl out of the water with flapping gills and flattened eyes." And then when she closes her eyes again, she has a vision that is almost identical to the one that Joseph, as a Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat, remember Joseph in his coat of many colors, has visionary dreams. And one of the first ones is the one that gets him in deep trouble with his brothers. This is back to Annie Dillard. "And I see stars, deep stars giving way to deeper stars bowing to deepest stars at the crown of an infinite cone." Now, if instead of the crown of an infinite cone, she had said at the crown of God, would you really have been surprised? I mean, stars bowing to deeper stars, bowing to deepest stars. That's what Joseph sees, those stars and planets bowing to him. And that's one of the reasons his brothers get pissed off and throw him in a ditch. Or again, she writes, "Terror and a beauty insoluble are a riband of blue woven into the fringes of garments of things, both great and small." Does anybody remember that in the Bible? A riband of blue woven into the fringes of garments of things? No, does that mean you just got it? You just remembered it? I only kind of made the connection this last time I read it myself. There's a moment when Moses asks to see God, and God says, I can't show you my face because that would kill you, but wait here. And so Moses waits, and what he sees is basically the back of God's head and his garment sweeping by, and he sees that God is wearing the phylacteries that Jewish men pray with, and he's wearing a tzitzit, basically. It's a kind of an undergarment, kind of a shawl or scarf that has a thread of blue woven through it and has fringes. So do I think that Annie Dillard knew what she was writing about there? You bet I do. Sure. I don't think it'd be pretty cool if it was a coincidence, but I think she's making these references because they're like just part of her. The closest thing I can come to describing what that might be like is if you've ever read Harry Potter, and I assume some of you have read Harry Potter, you'll see that she's just constantly coming up with references to mythical creatures, and even the Latin sort of words for things connect to other sort of stories and creatures. To me, it feels like it's not even coming from the front of her brain. It's coming from the back of her brain, right? The place where I'm storing, as Jesse said, all the ads for Coca-Cola that have been fed to me unconsciously. For some reason, J.K. Rowling just has these myths in the back of her brain, and she's so inventive that she is a kind of magician, I feel. She just pulls one magical thing after another out of this deep well of what she has absorbed. And I feel the same way about Annie Dillard. That when she writes, she's sort of taken in all of this other kind of material, and it's just there for her as part of her kind of, I don't know, world or spiritual vocabulary. So it feels very natural. Of course, in her discussion of the blind who are given sight, she talks about a different kind of seeing, again, which is like a metaphor for all seeing, not seeing, right? She's very concerned here with the idea of what do we see, what don't we see? Do you remember one man who was restored to sight describes lemonade as being square because of the way it prickled his tongue? And some of the newly sighted still grope their way across the floor on hands and knees or test things out with their tongues because that's their old way of knowing things, and it's hard for them to decode what they're seeing. One person asks why these objects all have dark marks all over them, and I think it's the mom explains, well, it's shadows, and they have sometimes a distorted sense of perspective. Someone is asked how big a parent is, and they go like this, right? Probably because that's, how far away maybe the person is, that they somehow, even though they could touch the mother's hand, let's say, and know that it's bigger than this would suggest, there's still this sense of kind of disorientation. In general, though, she writes, the newly sighted see the world as a dazzle of color patches. And that raises the question of, like, what are we really seeing? She writes, I reel in confusion. I don't understand what I see. So can we trust our eyes? It's actually a famous prayer that says, do not trust your eyes. Do not follow your eyes. What are we missing? The visionary will always see things that are kind of beyond and hidden inside the world as we know it. Blake's famous line is, if the doors of perception were cleansed, then we would see the world as it really is, infinite. If our doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it really is, infinite. So Blake saw us as being too often trapped by our five senses. And Annie Dillard writes, all day long I walked among shifting color patches that parted before me like the Red Sea, back to Moses again, and closed again in silence, transfigured. So much of it is about transfiguration. It's funny that somebody can live so intensely in the real world, looking so closely at the little minutiae of the world, and at the same time be kind of like peering through it in a way to see if there's something she's not seeing, something in addition to what she's seeing. And that sort of takes me to what I see as the second climax in this chapter, which is when Annie finally herself sees the trees with the lights in it. Remember, there's the little girl who's blind, and she's taken out into a garden, and she marvels at it, and she's looking at the tree with the lights in it. So here's this passage. And one of the reasons I'm talking about this passage is because the last time I taught this chapter in a Walk into Nature class, I wasn't doing lectures first, and I would just sort of throw the material at students, and then we would talk about it during the next class, which was always my way of teaching. And I think maybe I had one or at most two students in the class who understood that what happened to Annie Dillard in this scene is in fact a sort of transcendent, transfiguring, visionary experience, right? Like Blake as a child going out into his backyard and seeing angels in the trees. That's what he saw. When Moses saw the burning bush, he had a vision, and out of that vision, he heard God speaking. So, whether you call it a vision or you call it schizophrenia, which is what most people call it when they're talking about William Blake now, it is, yeah, it's a big part of the sort of religious tradition to have these visionary moments, and people were just confused. They were just like, I don't understand what actually happened. What did she see? Maybe it was a really sunny day, so she was looking at like a lot of sunlight, and it may be that that was the trigger. It might have been a trigger of the way sunlight hits the leaves. I think we've all had moments when we look at something and it's so alive we can't almost believe it. But here we go. When her doctor took her bandages off and led her into the garden, the girl who was no longer blind saw, quote, the trees with the lights in it. It was for this tree I searched through the peach orchards of summer, in the forests of fall, and down winter and spring for years. Then one day I was walking along Tinker Creek, thinking of nothing at all, and I saw the tree with the lights in it. I saw the backyard cedar where the mourning doves roost, charged and transfigured, each cell buzzing with flame. I stood on the grass with the lights in it, grass that was wholly fire, utterly focused and utterly dreamed. It was less like seeing than like being for the first time seen, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. The flood of fire abated, but I'm still spending the power. Gradually, the lights went out in the cedar. The colors died. The cells unflamed and disappeared. I was still ringing. I had been my whole life a bell and never knew it until at that moment I was lifted and struck. I have since only very rarely seen the tree with the lights in it. The vision comes and goes, mostly goes, but I live for the moment when the mountains open and a new light roars in spate through the crack and the mountains slam. And that is how she ends the chapter called Seeing. I had been my whole life a bell and never knew it until at that moment I was lifted and struck. And she talks about how this moment felt not so much like a moment of her seeing as of being seen. And who do you suppose, or what do you suppose is seeing her at that moment? It certainly does sound like a visionary experience to me. Nuns and monks have written about their marriage to God and feeling this powerful connection between them. And it feels to me very akin to that, whatever you might call that power. And she says, I'm still spending it. So I don't know if any of you have ever had an experience like that, or know anyone who has ever had an experience like that. I was looking at this material earlier I was going to say in the month, but it must have been last month. But I remembered for the first time in a really long time that when I was a kid, I was always afraid I was going to turn out to be an epileptic. And I guess I always pictured sort of grand mal seizures. They really terrified me for some reason. And I thought, one of these days, I am going to have a, a vision. I guess I assumed it would be a vision of God, and I'm going to be struck in the middle of doing something like, buying bubble gum at the corner store, and I'm going to fall down on the floor in a grand mal seizure. And then what am I going to do? And I used to be so afraid of being struck by those visions. And I think now I'm afraid of not being struck by those visions. I haven't thought about that in a long time. I really used to go around sort of feeling like I was just at the edge of that thing happening. I guess perhaps I would say I've had a similar kind of experience, maybe once or twice. But I didn't fall down on the floor or have a grand mal seizure, so that was good. I guess. All right. Yes, I mean, I agree with you. Her work does remind me of Van Gogh also. You look at, for instance, if you look at Starry Night, Starry Night would be exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. I think I used to be afraid that if I looked too closely at Starry Night, I would simply go into that vision and I would lose it. I would just be gone and I would fall into some kind of fit. But I think you can feel that when you look at something like Starry Night. You realize what he was seeing when he looked up at the stars, when he looked up at the starry sky. It's incredible, right? It's like 4th of July fireworks explosion, but it's happening every instant that you're looking at light. It's happening when you're looking at the sun. Do you remember how Annie Dillard gets so sad that daylight comes because she's thinking about all the sort of shooting stars that she's not seeing at that moment because she knows that that's been going on a particular night. And so she describes it as having a blue dome clamped over the earth. It's kind of keeping her from seeing what's really happening among those stars. I mean, we look at the sun all the time when we glance at it anyway. And we say, oh, it's a sunny day or it's nice and sunny. Do you ever think to yourself that you're looking at a star? I don't think I do. But somehow I think that's part of what Van Gogh is doing. And yeah, I think it's cool that a lot of us thought of that. When you think of color patches, and I mean, I think about the Impressionists as doing that anyway. And again, to me, it feels like magic because I'm not a painter, I'm not an artist. But I used to have this trick. I would stand in front of an Impressionist painting. I wouldn't quite know what I was looking at, and I would squint my eyes. This is probably not telling you guys anything you haven't already been told. But if you squint your eyes at an Impressionist landscape, let's say, you'll suddenly see it clearly. And you'll know, for instance, if you're looking at a winter morning or twilight, it suddenly gets much clearer. It's almost like you have to unsee the scene in order to really see what the painter wants you to see. And I think, Van Gogh in his use of color does that a lot, So the fixed. Okay, well, it's funny. It's a bit like the upcoming Carolyn Forche reading. My other class on poetry, we're getting to the poets of witness, and that some of that material is really, really hard and sort of tough to take and digest. And I really find myself feeling that way about the fixed. In fact, of course, I was kind of rereading the whole book. And when I got to the end of it, and I realized that our next book was going to be Tony Hiss's The Experience of Place, I felt a little like the description that Dante gives when he's come through the inferno uh, and he comes back up and sees the blue sky, and it looks to him like the hem of the Virgin Mary's gown, and he just feels the incredible openness of seeing blue sky above him again, like coming into the clear air. And that's a little bit how I felt when I realized the next thing I got to read would be The Experience of Place. Um, some of you, of course, are happy to be in the poetry and even in the darkness. And, God bless you, right? That's great. But for me, even the poetry, I found myself just needing something a little more prosaic is the wrong word, but I mean literally like more like prose and more like the world I recognize. So, we're lucky. Tony has agreed to talk with us. He'll be with us on November 19th, and it's a very different kind of world. He's going to put us right in Grand Central Station almost to begin with. So, however, before we get to go there, we've got to go through the praying mantises and so on. I don't think I'm going to go through a lot of the details, the sort of gory details, but hopefully you guys did and can appreciate the fact that she doesn't only show us the loving, lovely side of nature. She's trying to keep it real, as my fiance likes to say. She shows us, and I mean she literally shows us moment by moment the praying mantis biting the head off of its mate, those battling mantises who hatch out and then they all kill each other until there's only two left, and then those two kill each other as well. It sometimes, reminds me, definitely that reminds me of politics, just that sense of this kind of like raw, it's the darkest side of nature, right? It doesn't even feel like it's not survival of the fittest if nobody survives. It's just kind of the dark, violent, destructive, power-seeking side of nature, which really you can't just turn your head away from it and say, oh, how lovely it is to, walk among the birds and the bees and the flowers. I don't know if I told you guys this, but last week I was coming outside with a scarf on. Did I tell you that? And there was a bug on it. And I just freaked out. I ran out onto the porch because I didn't want to have to kill this bug. And I just shook it off of the shawl or scarf or whatever. And I thought, yeah, right. You would really be right at home with Mary Oliver sitting there studying the grasshopper. And, when she talks about the praying mantis, I'm thinking about the grasshopper and thinking, I can't even tolerate whatever the heck it was that was on my scarf. I can just see myself feeding a grasshopper out of my hand, or even worse, really looking closely at, some kind of a, what are they called? When you live on somebody else's being, when animals do that. And sometimes it's okay because they both survive, like the little birds that live on the backs of alligators and clean their teeth, apparently. But other times you do it and the host is destroyed. Parasite, I think, is the word I'm looking for. So, you have the glued together moth who's trapped in its bell jar and dragging itself down the driveway. I just found that so compelling and so terrible. And okay, I think this might be the one passage from the fix that I can actually bear to read. So I'll just kind of remind you of this. And it's really because they didn't release him in time, right? So he just ended up, stuck together. Because he was supposed to be out in the open where he could become this beautiful, amazing moth, which is what he was supposed to become. And the dunderheaded teacher just stuck it in the ubiquitous mason jar He heaved himself down the asphalt driveway by infinite degrees unwavering. His hideous crumpled wings lay glued and rocked on his back, perfectly still now like a collapsed tent. The bell rang twice. I had to go. The moth was receding down the driveway, dragging on. I went. I ran inside. The, the Polyphemus moth is still crawling down the driveway hunched, crawling down the driveway on 6 furred feet forever. It's really, she's pretty intense, right? Receding down the driveway, crawling down the driveway, crawling down the driveway, crawling down the driveway. And yet, you're right, Kayla. She writes the scene so amazingly that, like, I'm not even hearing in my head that she's using the same phrase over and over. I'm simply seeing that moth, sort of limping its way, creeping its way down the driveway because it's been damaged by human beings, of course, is what that comes to. And I think her writing is so vivid, even when she's describing something horrible. To me, it has the kind of gripping power, literally, of a horror movie. I don't think that's overstating the case. The idea of the fixed, I think for her, is terrible and terrifying. And I don't think it's accidental, the bodies of water that our writers have chosen to write about. The fact that Thoreau lived on a pond, which is this kind of clear, peaceful place to be and meditate on, the nature of things. And, for Rachel Carson, she's by the sea, just this enormous place teeming with life. And for Annie Dillard, it's by a creek or a stream. It's constantly moving and changing and transforming. And I never realized when she would write about going and straddling that log on the creek, that was probably just about all there was there. To me, it just felt like it must be this one log in the middle of this vast wilderness. And yet she does make a world out of the small. And whether it's beautiful or terrible, it's still part of the beautiful and terrible thing that I think she believes is the world and even the force. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower is a line from a Dylan Thomas poem. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. And the idea of putting the force first and describing a stem as a green fuse is so beautiful. And I think she sees that force as being beautiful and terrible at the same time. And that is a great part of her genius. Now, speaking of her genius, I do want to at least point out to you the kind of metaphors that she fills this whole book with, really. And the images, right? Like she describes the turtle smooth as a beam gliding through the water. I would never think to describe a turtle as a beam, but when she said it, I thought, that's exactly right. Kate, that's amazing. That's amazing. Maybe I really could have been. Maybe I really was fighting off something I didn't even know that I was. Years later, I actually found myself in a hospital with wires all over my head, and they were checking me to see if I had epilepsy because I was having something that appeared to be seizures. It actually turned out to be cluster headaches, and I was not one. artistic afterward, but what an amazing thing, right? Kind of like Paul on the road to Damascus being struck by lightning. I've always taken that as a metaphor that people can be struck by vision anytime. And that's why I love poetry in some ways, because I think that people can become a poet at any age. And I do believe that people can become artists at any age. If you've never seen the work of Grandma Moses, you should look at it, because I think she started painting in her, I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, lived to be about 100. But to resume, uh, she writes, night was knitting an eyeless mask over my eyes. Um, she's just constantly writing in terms of metaphor and simile. She has so many of the qualities of poet. She uses metaphor, simile, imagery, rhythm. Um, so it's very, very poetic prose. And I think you can feel that as you're reading these passages, right? And that's part of why they are so vivid. And somehow she gets away with it. She gets away with all the this like that and this as that. And she loads on the images, and it's lush, but it still feels very real. So I guess I would just sort of remind you that the moth was imprisoned in the mason jar. In other words, it was fixed, right? And when she is resenting daylight, she's describing the sky as clamped down over the land, like lid on a pot. Again, something that is fixed in place. Anything that is fixed, I think, gives the impression of a malevolent something, creator, force, God, whatever you would want to call it, that does not grant us free will, who has created a world filled with sort of inevitable violence, a kind of a brute existence, instinct, and extinction. And that is all sort of foretold. I mean, that's what, in many ways, the idea of divine providence could be seen as a good thing if you were a wealthy person and, beautiful and born into all kinds of advantages. But it was a terrible idea if you were born poor or crippled or a number of other things. And then you're told that actually you're that way because you were cursed from the beginning. And that's your fate, and you can't escape it. But her writing, as I've said, it's always exquisite and I think deliberate. And I wanted to show you just at the opening of that chapter, The Fixed, how many times you're going to see a word or an image that's going to suggest this idea of being trapped or fixed or frozen. I have just learned to see praying mantis egg cases. Suddenly, I see them everywhere. A tan oval of light catches my eye, or I notice a blob of thickness in a patch of slender weeds. As I write, I can see the one I tied to the mock orange hedge outside my study window. It is over an inch long, shaped like a bell or like the northern hemisphere of an egg cut through its equator. The full length of one of its long sides is affixed to a twig. The side that catches the light is perfectly flat. It has a dead straw, dead weed color, and a curious brittle texture, hard as varnish, but pitted minutely like frozen foam. So whether it's in the large or the small, she is able to create images that show us what she's talking about. And I just find it so interesting that even at the beginning of the chapter called The Fixed, she's showing us these things she's tied and fixed, and that this thing looks like frozen foam. And that, I think, is part of her genius as a writer. And because I didn't want to end the class with talking about something immobile, fixed, and frozen, I have a poem for you by a contemporary poet. I don't know them. I just came across the poem and I thought of you guys. And a couple of quotes from Annie Dillard, too. So here we go. Here's one that's a kind of a warning quote, and then the other one is sort of like a blessing. And again, isn't that very Annie Dillard to, on the one hand, warn us against becoming fixed, and on the other hand, to encourage us to look at the things that not everybody notices, to notice the things we don't notice, and spend our time not so much wisely, but beautifully. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule is a mock-up of reason and order, willed, faked, and so brought into being. It is a peace and a haven set into the wreck of time. It is a lifeboat on which you find yourself decades later, still living. So I think that's a warning against living by schedules. You create a lifeboat thinking at some point you're going to be able to get off that lifeboat and onto land. You can walk around freely, but then decades later, you might still be floating on the lifeboat of your daily planner and your calendar. So here's something happier, where she says, go up into the gaps. If you can find them, they shift and vanish too. Squeak into a gap in the soil, turn and unlock, more than a maple, a universe. This is how you spend this afternoon and tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. Spend the afternoon. You can't take it with you. That was clever and beautiful. Now, have I told you guys yet that I've posted on Blackboard, that I sent out an announcement, both of the Carolyn Forche reading on November 12th at 7, and also the fact that I am going to be collecting a mini submission of your work on, I think it's November 8th, which is coming up. But mostly I'm wanting to see your piece that you wrote about a close call you had. And then I think it's either one or two other pieces from your reading journal, and you get to choose them. So take a look at that. And you'll also see that there's something under Google Docs now. It's called Google Assignment or something. And supposedly that makes it hugely easy for you to submit something as a Google Doc. I'm going to pray that that is true. That is what I was told. That's why I created the assignment that way. And we will just have to see if it's true. If it's not true, we'll go back to the old way of doing it. I don't think anybody in this class struggled too terribly much with submitting work under assignments and just sending you the link. But this is supposedly easier still. So we will see. Okay, so this poem, this is very interesting, actually. This poem I got from a publication called The Hollands Critic. So you remember I told you that Annie Dillard went to Hollands and her husband, Richard Dillard, was her teacher, then her husband. He is still there. He's still one of the editors of this periodical. I'm actually a contributing editor, so I haven't contributed an article in probably a couple of years. But I found this poem called Carvin's Cove Morning, and it made me think of you guys. It seems sort of almost like a modern day version of a Mary Oliver-ish poem, and it takes place by the water. Somebody is in a rowboat. Carvin's Cove Morning by Miranda Dennis. There are ghosts in this wrist to be shaken out by the cunning pull of water against the shore. I dip an oar. I don't know what I'm doing. Sun is a mercy. Where the wind goes, I go, but not dragged. More like mist rises up to greet me and me alone, here in my new plastic home, cut out to look like the orange bill of some forgotten bird, here at the edge of the world. Dipping my hand, I unsettle myself and touch warm water bright as a copper penny, left to glimmer, left to milk the bone of its strength. I'm a current now, a shriek of lightning that finds what little salt in fresh water. So, I thought of you guys. I love the idea that there are poems being written even now that are about some of the things that we've been reading and care about. So, okay. Do you guys have any questions for me? This Thursday, we're going to have some presentations, which I think are probably much needed by now, on kind of like the psychological effects of nature on us. And one of you, I think it's John, is going to be talking about, especially during the time of COVID. So I'm looking forward to that. I always look forward to Thursdays, I have to admit. And any questions? Okay, well, seeing none, I hope if you have not yet voted, you will for sure go out there and vote. I will be chewing on what's not left of my fingernails for the rest of the day. But thanks for spending time together. This actually was very helpful. So I'll see you guys on Thursday, all right? Take care.